Hello everyone, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance again, and welcome to my 5.8 Imaginarium Theater guide. Nod Krai is on the horizon, and so much cool drip marketing came out, and so for saving up for all those characters, I hope I can help you get some primo gems from this theater. We've got a bit of an odd combination of elements this time around. The selection is Electro, Cryo, and Animo. And normally, the combo of Electro and Cryo would encourage you to go down the Superconduct route, maybe supporting physical characters some more. But because of Animo not helping out physical whatsoever, this is more about your Cryo and Electro carries. Back near the start of Natlan, the damage of the Superconduct reaction got buffed, so it's not quite as insignificant as you'd think. But because of the addition of Animo in this theater, the biggest change is that many of the early chambers have a lot of enemies in. So characters that can easily hit multiple targets or do lots of grouping are a lot more effective. Talking about that, we should probably touch on some of the stronger characters this theater. Oresa is usually good in these theaters because she just has naturally high numbers, so she doesn't need as much support from her teammates. And as I mentioned, characters like Sucrose, Venti, Kazuha, any with really strong grouping are very useful in those earlier stages. Chaska is also one of the stronger characters this theater, mainly because she kind of works with any elemental combination, and allows you to easily proc any of the blessings. But as usual, because it's theater, your characters get a lot of buffs irrelevant of their kit, and so character strength isn't really that significant. I don't normally talk about blessings, but there are two blessings I want to mention for this theater. The first one being in the Superconduct blessing route. At level 2, the blessing lets you pick one of two options, which is on dealing physical damage as one route, or on dealing cryo and electro damage as the second route. Now normally I would recommend picking the physical route, because the physical route just gives you damage. But because that's triggered on you doing physical damage and you don't do that much this theater, I'd recommend going on the route that buffs up your cryo and electro damage, and the second being an interesting option in the electro swirl route. Here you can pick Wind Blessing Electro, which lets you have enhanced jumps, allowing you to do plunge attacks for free. Now while the mechanic isn't that useful, there is an enemy this theater that is specifically weak to plunging attacks, and although it's not a boss, it's just an elite enemy at Act 7, I thought I would bring it up anyway. Now we'll go through the general tips. If you've heard them before, you can skip through them or you can stick around for the reminders. Firstly, make sure to use your characters in an appropriate order, using your weaker characters beforehand and your stronger characters later. It means if you have, say, too many healers, you should use some of those healers early on, because it's not often you'll need two healers in a team. You can save your best on-field damage dealers or maybe that borrowed character for later. This also applies for saving particular characters for select stages. This is quite apparent for this theater because I found the early stages need a lot more grouping than the later stages. But as usual, you can watch this video for the tips on which particular characters to bring for which bosses, and then plan out your teams using that information so you know when you need to save characters. As usual, mystery caches are pretty useful to take, especially the ones that cost you currency, whether that's 15 or 40, as they'll usually have super valuable buffs in. If you have the chance to borrow a stronger character from a friend, you should always do so. It can give you access to a cool character you wouldn't have otherwise, or just let you get through 2 stages very easily. I wouldn't say there's any character out of the ordinary that's super strong this theater, so the characters I'd recommend to borrow would just be the strongest ones. So for example, a well-invested Oresa or Skirk. Because either way, as a reminder, all your characters get buffs from blessing levels. You get an extra 2 blessing levels for every character you bring in that's over the minimum. You get a blessing level every time you pick a blessing card. The blessing levels give 800 health, 50 attack, 50 defense, and 20 elemental mastery. And to make up for the special invitation characters not really interacting with the current blessings, they get double of these stats. Remember to equip your characters appropriately. What I mean by that is even if they're a weak character, if you give them a Favonius sword, a crit rate circlet, and stick them on Noblesse, Viridescent, even Scroll, they're still buffing up your team even if they're not doing much damage themselves. And so in turn you put your most investment on your damage dealers, letting them carry you through the stages. Last thing I wanted to note is that remember you only need 9 stars to get the maximum rewards. So if there's one stage you're really struggling to get a star on, you can always just leave that one without a star. Right, let's take a look at the opening characters. This time around we have Yae, Kuki, Ganyu, Layla, Mizuki, and Sucrose. Yae is an okay damage dealer, Kuki's a consistent healer. Ganyu will be a fine on-field damage dealer and Layla's a nice shielder. Mizuki and Sucrose do very similar things. Sucrose has more CC and Mizuki does a little bit of healing. They're both characters that do most of their damage through swirls. For the first two stages, I would almost recommend trying to use Mizuki. That's because most of the combat in both acts has a lot of enemies in them, and because Mizuki's a standard character, she's a little weaker, so you can consume all her uses earlier. Special guest star characters, you have Nahida, Neuvillette, Jinchou, and Garming. Nahida is great for enabling aggravate teams for characters like Sino, and Neuvillette's just a really consistent damage dealer, especially because we're facing so many enemies. Jinchou enables a lot of teams, from Freeze with Skirk to Electrocharge with Inefa. Lastly, Garming, because you have so many cryo support characters, is a very good damage dealer, especially if you manage to get C6 on him. So most of the guest star characters are pretty good pickups. So let's get right into Act 1. From my testing in Act 1, the nicer stages are those with the mechs or the ruin machines. For the slimes, there's just a lot of them to defeat. The specters are quite annoying to deal with. They spawn a little bit apart and in groups of 3. It's difficult to crowd control them together. If you're relying on animo damage, there's animo immune specters. For the fungi, there's just a lot of them to defeat. And even if your team has strong grouping capabilities, they can easily spread themselves out. In fact, I want to take a moment to go a little bit more in detail on facing multiple enemies, as we do that a lot this theater. There's a few ways to work out which stages will be convenient, considering the case that there's lots of enemies and we have the capability of grouping them. Ideally, you want some kind of common human enemy. That's because most of the common human enemies will, first of all, chase you. Secondly, they can be very easily staggered, stopping them from attacking, and very easily grouped with crowd control abilities. Whereas if they're elites and heavier enemies, it might take more effort to group them, especially things like ruin machines and mechs. And so in some of the later stages, when you have multiple mechs all over the map, it's really annoying to deal with them. Of course, when you're taking this to account, it's all within the AoE capabilities of your team. You have Neuvillette who can hit all the enemies across the map. That doesn't really matter so much. If your characters are a single target, like for example Fremine, then you definitely want the enemies to be near each other. So try to take the stages with fewer enemies if your characters are more proficient at single target. Even in instances like this, like the fungi, when you have multiple enemies, they're easy to group next to each other, they can still be very annoying to deal with. Because if one enemy ends up scattered elsewhere, it can take you just as long to deal with that one enemy as it did 5 other enemies. Going back to this, the easiest stage for me was the ruin machines. In Act 2, you can also see again we're facing a lot of enemies. As I mentioned, the humanoid factions which will chase you are quite easy to deal with, whether that's the Saurians or even the elite version. Or if you're better at single target, you can try taking on the Fatui. Something I should also mention, because we have so many animo characters, is about fall damage. You're fighting some enemies like these elite Fatui that can be knocked around quite easily. You can send them flying up into the air. When they hit the ground, either having fallen far enough or being pulled down by something like a sucrose burst, they will take fall damage, and that's true damage, and that's always based on their percentage HP. So if they have a lot of health, they'll take more fall damage. The constructs are a little bit annoying to deal with. After a certain amount of time, they'll go invisible, and unless you have Nahida on the team, it'll be difficult to reveal them. If you're fighting the Kairagi, make sure to defeat both of the elites at the same time so one of them doesn't self-heal. After Act 2, we're on to the Jade Plume Terrorshroom. Most important thing to bring for the Jade Plume Terrorshroom's mechanic is lots of electro hits, so usually I save Yai for this chamber. Any hit of electro will increase its fury meter. Once that meter is full to max, it will become activated and do an especially aggressive attack. This can be one where it charges off to the edge of the arena and runs back, or it can quickly just do some head swipes. But after it's done this more dangerous attack, it becomes exhausted for 15 seconds, lying down on the ground, becoming paralyzed, and losing 25% resistance to all damage types. In fact, you can charge up this meter a little faster because some of its attacks infuse itself with Dendro, and when you trigger the catalyzed reaction, which is a combination of Dendro and Electro on it, it charges the meter up faster. That's all there is to the Jade Plume Terrorshroom. It's not too complicated when you're not bringing a Pyro character. Act 4, we no longer have the safe options. In the previous theaters, I've always suggested going and fighting something like an automaton. You can just fight one of them at once and distract them. There's not a single chamber now where you can pick to fight a single enemy at a time. It's always multiple, and so I always save Sucrose for this chamber, or any character with very strong crowd control, because a lot of these enemies are lighter enemies that you can easily crowd control and stop from attacking the Monolith. At least most of the enemies can, and if there might be one enemy attacking it, but you only need 35% health for that start. And so anything from the Fatui and the Treasure Hunters to the Saurians, or even the Eremites, I think are the better picks. If your characters are a little bit better at single target, both the fewer Eremites and even the Kairagi can be dealt with, as there's only normally 2 of them active at once, and they'll group together pretty well trying to attack you. The worst one is absolutely the Rune Machines, as a lot of them like doing range attacks. In Act 5 you have the option of fighting Geo or Electro Rift Hound, and so because Rift Hounds take more damage if they take damage from their own element, if you have strong Electro characters, go fight the Electro Rift Hounds. I wouldn't recommend fighting the Geo ones because we have no Geo characters to pick from. Hydro Mimics are okay options if you have strong Cryo and Electro characters. Just remember, if you take an Anemo character, they're only going to be able to swirl Hydro. I don't really like the Fontaine mechs or the Fungi as there's a lot you have to deal with, but the Rune Machines are fine. It's quite nice, a lot of the bosses in this theatre don't have really complicated mechanics, and after that we're against the PMA in Act 6. The PMA isn't too complicated, you keep damaging it down until it gets to 30% where you can no longer damage it past it. Once you get it down to below 35% HP, it will start the transformation animation as soon as it's finished whichever attack it's doing. Here it splits itself up into 4 parts and the core becomes immune. The 4 parts are summoned as individual Rune Machines: the Snake, the Cruiser, the Crab, and the Jellyfish. You only need to defeat the one that's got the glowing ring of runes around it to make the core vulnerable again. Something important to know is how to get the enemies to be right next to the core, and so as soon as you defeat that selected Rune Machine, you can start damaging the core. Oh, and the one that gets selected is random, so if you get a bad one, say the Crab or the Jellyfish which have higher HP, then you can just retry the chamber to hopefully get the Cruiser or the Snake. Crab will either attack you from range or try to jump to you, so if you distance yourself far enough it will then try and get close to you, meaning you can get it right next to the core. Same goes for the Snake, it has a chance to do an attack where it burrows next to you. The Jellyfish is the most annoying as it will slowly drift over to you. Cruiser will dash back away from you if you're near it, and so by standing on the opposite side of it to the core you can get it to dash right next to the core. Once you've defeated that Rune Machine, the core will become vulnerable again and even have its resistances reduced by 50% for about 20 seconds. As we get later into the stages, we face less and less enemies, and you can see this in Act 7. Again, for the Rift Hounds, if you have electro damage dealers, they're a good choice. Even though they have slightly higher Anemo resistance, my usual option is in fact to pick the Joawen Beasts and the Automaton. It's only 4 enemies you have to defeat. I would only take on the Weasel if you happen to have either the Blessing that gives you the plunging attack or a character that plunges, and even for the elite fight I didn't find the Natlan Warriors too bad. You choose to run over to the ranged one and they group themselves in pairs very easily. On the other hand, because of the Bishops continually draining you energy and having high resistance to Cryo and Electro, I didn't find them as comfortable. And then we're on to another fairly neutral boss, the Maguu Kenki. The Maguu Kenki is invulnerable for the first few seconds you fight it, but you can use abilities to get energy from it. Not that that really matters. After that you can damage it down to 70% health, in which it will then do an area-wide attack, becoming invulnerable again. That's the only real mechanic to it. The other thing you can do to manipulate it is it will sometimes do an attack where it dashes backwards if you're standing too close to it. So if it's in between attacks and it's choosing which to cast next, you can just go stand far enough away from it to stop it dashing backwards, and then run close to it again, causing it to do a different attack pattern. There's no elemental checks, there's no high resistances, it's really a nice boss. In Act 9 it looks like we're facing a lot of enemies, but remember this is the one where you have to defeat multiple of the large opponents while ignoring the rest of them. My favourite here is the Hillychels, and in fact the small enemies are just there to provide you lots of energy. The Rune Machines are a pretty safe bet as well. Again, we have a third appearance of Electro Rift Hounds as an option, and I would avoid the Saurians, because you have to defeat 5 of them, and that's quite a lot in comparison to other chambers where you might only have to defeat 3 or 2. And lastly, we're on to the Suanni. Here you need to make sure you're bringing a character with Cryo, and I wouldn't recommend relying on Nervelet or Anemo damage dealers for this boss, because it has higher Anemo and Hydro resistance. Suanni has 2 main mechanics, one where it starts infusing itself with Hydro, and doing a large amount of Hydro damage around the arena. Here you simply need to apply Cryo to it and then trigger another reaction off it, whether that's Shatter with a blunt attack like a Claymore character, Superconduct with Electro, or even swirling it. It's because during that mechanic, when it infuses itself with Hydro, it gains a lot of resistances, and then as soon as you break it out of this, it loses those resistances again. This will happen when you've got it down to about 70% health, and then once you've got it lower, below 40% health, it has a chance to do another attack of a similar type. This one, it generates 3 swirling orbs around the edge of the arena. Here you just need to infuse any of these orbs with any element, so probably Electro or Cryo, by just hitting them with Electro or Cryo. Once you've infused all 3 of them, the Suanni will become weak weakened again, losing all those resistances and taking a quick nap on the floor. Can periodically throughout the fight do little attacks where it dashes a short distance and applies Hydro to itself. If you're applying Cryo, when it does this, then you can again freeze it and knock it down with another reaction. And that's all there is to the Suanni. It's not too complicated either. I guess this theater really shows the difference between modern bosses and older bosses. I hope they return to this where you can have more creative teams to defeat them in the future. But who knows what Nod Krai holds. In fact, there may also be serious changes coming to Imaginarium Theater at some point, which is another whole thing I'll have to deal with. But in the meanwhile, if you found this video helpful and you enjoyed yourself, feel free to share it with other people that you think might find it useful. Leave a comment if there's things that I missed out that you thought might be helpful to other people, or subscribe and like if you want to make sure you catch this for next time, or when I do other endgame guides, as the new Stygian Onslaught is releasing in less than a week. Anyway, I hope you've managed to get all the rewards you can from this. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day, and thanks for watching. Bye!